The year is 1933. Hitler and the Nazi Party were on the rise to power, and soon began one of the worst genocides in history, the Holocaust. The Holocaust single-handedly murdered millions as the world stood back and watched the disasters unfold. However, with the help of the White Rose, Sophie Scholl put her life at risk for the betterment of the people targeted by this genocide. This is their story of selflessness, heroism, and tragedy. The story of Sophie Scholl begins in 1933, when Hitler and the Nazi regime rose to power. Though at first young Sophie was unaffected by the Nazi regime's authority and effect on the German society, her father and older brother were significantly affected by the Nazi regime's power. Because of her father's rebelliousness, Sophie got the impression to take a stand for what she thought was correct from the very beginning, changing the course of her life forever. At the measly age of 12, Sophie joined a pseudo-Nazi group called the League of German Girls. Once her initial thoughts of joy faded, she began to question the group's methods as she became aware of the political views her fathers and teachers held. Due to this, Sophie started to take an interest in politics and began to become politically aware. As a result, Sophie began to choose her friends very wisely, mainly choosing people who were sympathetic to her political views. Later on, Nuremberg laws were passed, which added to the discrimination against Jews, fueling the flame that would lead Sophie to stand up and take her stand against the Nazi regime. In 1937, several of Sophie's friends were participating in the German Youth Movement, which is a group that did numerous outdoor activities. This group was not supported by the Nazi regime, making it illegal to be a member of, leading to their arrest. This event left a lasting footprint on Sophie. Sophie later was enlisted into the Auxiliary War Service as a nursery teacher in Blomberg due to the start of World War II. Once Sophie returned, she began to participate in passive resistant war efforts. 6 months later, Sophie enrolled in the University of Munich. With the help of her family and first and second-hand experience pushing her along the way, Sophie began her biggest and final opposition against the Nazi regime. As the summer of 1942 rolled around, friends who discovered each other by a love of art, music, literature, philosophy, and theology began to question and oppose the policies of the Nazi regime. This group of friends, who were Hans Scholl, William Graf, Christopher Probst, Alex Schmerl, Ingi Scholl, Sophie Scholl, and university professor Kurt Hubert, decided that the way to fight for what they saw was correct was to use passive resistance tactics. This group of friends later called themselves the White Rose. Between June 1942 and February 1943, the group distributed 6 political resistance leaflets, which called for the restoration of democracy and social justice across central Germany. During an academic break, several of the group's members were sent to the Eastern Front for military service, halting the group's actions until later that fall, when the men returned. In January 1943, after acquiring a hand-operated duplicating machine, the White Rose were generating leaflets by the thousands. They were making 6,000 to 9,000 copies of their 5th leaflet entitled Appeal to All Germans. This leaflet warned that Hitler was dragging Germany into the abyss. These leaflets traveled to various towns across Germany via courier runs. Although 60% of the leaflets that the White Rose made were turned in by the recipients, the group avoided arrest by the Gestapo for 2 whole years. After copies of their leaflets had risen in the University of Hamburg, students began to copy and distribute the leaflets for themselves. Soon after that, copies began to appear as far as Austria. These events were driving the Gestapo furious. Even with massive amounts of effort, the Gestapo could not track down the authors or any member of the White Rose. Unfortunately, on February 18, 1943, the group's luck came crashing down around them after Sophie and Hans were caught distributing leaflets in the University of Munich. After their arrest, a brief search and investigation was conducted, which resulted in the arrest of Christopher Probst. 4 days later, on February 22nd, their trial began. Led by Roland Freisler, he treated the trial as if he were not the judge, but as if he were the prosecutor. No witnesses were called to the trial, as the 3 admitted the whole truth. As the trial dragged on, Sophie told Freisler that somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare to express themselves as we did. As the trial began to draw to an end, Freisler made his judgment. The verdict was guilty of treason. Their sentence? Death. That afternoon, the three were led to their execution. Sadly, they were not the last to die. After the Gestapo's relentless investigation, they uncovered Alex Morel, William Graff, and Gert Huber, who were all tried for treason and sentenced to death. But the Gestapo did not stop their investigation there. They then sent students who attended the University of Munich to concentration camps or to their death, which created a fear machine that kept the German people quiet and afraid to do what was right. The members of the White Rose were not willing to allow such an event like the Holocaust to darken the history of Germany, which is why they took their stand against the Nazi regime. After their death, the legend of the White Rose lived on. The White Rose demonstrated to the world that, amidst the silence in Nazi Germany, there were still people out there with a conscience and a will to fight. The White Rose recognized and had a voice for the guilt felt by every German. The group's efforts and actions proved to the world that Germany was not a country full of anti-Semites, but were still people who had a consideration towards human life. However, this also showed the gut-wrenching realization that so few wanted to fight, that there were so few White Roses. Though the group failed in their efforts to create an uproar grand enough to topple Hitler and the Nazi regime, the White Rose preserved the Germans' dignity for future generations who wanted to show their courage to act. The White Rose resistance demonstrates what a little courage and morality can do. In the face of one of the darkest times in history, the White Rose tried their hardest to give the world a chance to fight for what they knew was morally correct, helping to aid in the healing of the huge scar that the Holocaust created. The White Rose stood for an elemental ethics, which was to choose your manner of life and to live it in freedom. The story of Sophie Scholl and the White Rose began in 1933, in the midst of a genocide that was wreaking havoc all across Europe. This genocide was known as the Holocaust, and was led by Hitler and the Nazi Party. After their stand and their deaths, their story of selflessness, heroism, and tragedy lives on. Their story will never be forgotten, and will be told for generations to come. Maybe now, we will all follow in their footsteps, and stand up for what we all know is morally correct.